Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining this session. Today's session is Back to Basics, Part 2, a step-by-step guide to sponsoring a skilled worker. And the session's up to date as at 10th of May 2024, but if you're watching it after this date, please do check the latest policy guidance because the rules do change frequently, and that's available on UKVI's website. And do also remember that this is just an overview session, so it's always worth taking advice or consulting the rules on specific situations. But for those of you who don't know, I'm Elaine McIlroy, one of the partners in the Employment and Immigration team at Brodies. And with me today is Gregor Murphy, one of the senior solicitors in the team, and we'll each be covering part of the session. So I'm going to start with the agenda, if we can just move on to the next slide. And we're going to cover a number of topics today. So first of all, how to check who's eligible for sponsorship under the skilled worker visa route, how to apply for and assign a certificate of sponsorship, completion of the visa application form and what supporting documents need to be submitted by the applicant. We're also going to cover urgent applications, timing and costs. And at the end, I'll touch on some of the requirements very briefly on record keeping and reporting obligations. But it's worth bearing in mind that in one of our other back to basic sessions on compliance obligations, we've got a lot more detail on that side of things on record keeping and compliance. So if you want, you can find that webinar available on our website. So if we just move on to the next slide then, the first point an employer needs to think about is who's eligible for sponsorship. But before I get into the detail of that, the good news is that our current skilled worker visa system is fairly open in terms of who can be sponsored to work in the UK. And the current points-based system has been in place since the end of the Brexit period, but with significant changes that were implemented on the 4th of April 2024, which we're going to incorporate into the session today. So at the end of the Brexit period, it did become far easier and more straightforward for an employer to sponsor someone to work in the UK, because before that date, employers had to demonstrate what was called a resident labour market test. So basically demonstrating that they couldn't find somebody from the resident workforce who could do the job. That test was swept away at the end of the Brexit period, and it became far easier and more straightforward to sponsor. And the rules were also changed at that point in time to cover both medium skilled as well as highly skilled jobs, so covering a really broad range of jobs in the UK. Some complexity has been added to the system since the 4th of April changes, so it's now not as straightforward as it was, albeit that there still isn't that resident labour market test, which is good news for employers. But what employers do need to consider carefully is whether they can meet the skills and salary thresholds, and we're going to look at that today. And provided you can do that, sponsorship is very possible for employers in many cases. The reason for the complexity that I mentioned is that you'll now see in the next couple of slides, I won't move on yet, is that we've got a more complex system of assessing who's eligible. And that's partly due to some transitional arrangements that we've got in place for people who were already sponsored before the 4th of April, who are subject to one set of rules. And then we've got a different set of rules for those sponsored on or after the 4th of April. An added complexity is also there because we've also got a whole bunch of variations to the rules that have been introduced. So there's various different scenarios with different salary requirements that employers need to work through in each case to figure out which ones apply. And we'll touch on some of those as we go through. Some employers are also experiencing more challenges since the 4th of April due to some higher salary thresholds, and in particular, those higher going rate salary requirements that I'll talk about. So that's made it more difficult for some jobs to be covered. And finally, before I kind of go through the requirements on the slide here, it's worth saying that these rules that we're talking about today, the skilled worker visa route rules, we're not going to cover today the global business mobility senior or specialist worker route, which used to be known as ICT, intercompany transfers, but we may well do a separate session on that. And if you can't meet the requirements under the skilled worker route, it can be worth exploring whether you might meet the requirements under that alternative category, senior or specialist worker category for some cases. So if we just go through these requirements on the slide then, for the skilled worker route, the first question an employer needs to address is whether the job is skilled enough. And it's the employer's job to match up the job in front of them that they want to sponsor with a relevant occupation code. The job codes or occupation codes were changed on the 4th of April to a new system called SOC 2020. It was previously based on SOC 2010 classification system, so do make sure you're looking at the right ones from the 4th of April. And these job codes are available on UKVI's website and in the immigration rules in terms of which jobs are covered for sponsorship. On the website, there is a list of job codes suitable for sponsorship, and it also sets out the minimum salary requirements that apply to that particular job. Do take care to look at the right list for skilled worker, because there are different routes up there as well and different lists of jobs. So some are suitable for that senior or specialist worker category, for example. And there are different salary levels listed out there for those who were in the skilled worker route before the 4th of April, and another set of salary levels for those who are being sponsored on or after the 4th of April. So do make sure you're looking at the right list, or do take advice on that. There is also up there a list called the Immigration Salary List, which used to be known as the Shortage Occupation List. Since the 4th of April, they've changed the name of that. And that's a list of jobs which is deemed to be in short supply in the UK. There are some benefits if your job code appears on that list because there's reduced visa fees, but it's not essential for it to be on that list for the job to be suitable for sponsorship. So anything, any job that's on the skilled worker list is suitable for sponsorship. And then finally on the list, like, it is a broad list of jobs. It was approximately doubled at the end of the Brexit transition period because it does cover medium as well as highly skilled jobs. And if you're struggling to match up or to find what the most suitable occupation code is, there are tools available to help with that process. And it's, yeah, for the employer basically to find the best match. It might not always be a perfect one, but you've just to find the closest one. So the second question that an employer needs to address when considering sponsorship is whether the role will meet the salary requirements. There are a number of different salary requirements you need to consider in each case. There is a minimum going rate for each occupation code that you need to look at, with some discounts available for specific cases. And when we move to the next couple of slides, we'll look at what some of those discounts are. There's also a second requirement you need to consider. So the minimum general threshold that applies in that case, and the amount of that will also depend on the circumstances. The standard one is 38,700, but there's various discounted ones available in particular cases, and the employer must pay the higher of those two rates, but it's worth bearing in mind that they're each calculated in different ways. And then there's usually an hourly minimum rate of either £15.88 per hour or £11.90 per hour, depending on the circumstances, and the employer must also meet that hourly rate requirement. So in terms of when the various salary levels are discounted, and we'll look at them in a bit more detail in the next couple of slides, but there's special cases for new entrants, and those are people who are under the age of 26 at the time they apply for their visa, or those switching from a student visa or switching from a graduate route visa, or if they're working towards certain recognised professional qualifications or accreditations. Other discounts are available to those who have got a PhD in some cases, and if you've got a PhD in a STEM subject, an increased discount may be available depending on the job code. There's other discounts available to jobs on the immigration salary list. There's also special discounts available to those who have health and care visas, so working in the NHS or in adult social care, and also special rules applicable to those jobs that are on a specific list of certain education and health jobs which are subject to national pay scales, and it's only those on the list that are subject to those special rules. And then finally, discounted rates also apply to people who benefit from the transitional arrangements because they were in the skilled worker route or had a certificate of sponsorship under it before the 4th of April. So you can see the complexity there. There's a whole range of different discounts you need to consider and check off all of those in each case. But if you get the correct list of salary levels that you're looking at for the particular job, you should be able to assess if the job's suitable for sponsorship. Final question an employer needs to consider in sponsoring someone is whether the financial requirement and the English language requirements are met. English language requirement can either be done by way of a test that meets UKVI's requirements, or if the person's done certain degrees taught in English, or it might be through their nationality. In the case of the financial requirement, the employer can often certify that through the sponsor management system, or the individual might produce bank statements to demonstrate that. And finally, the last thing to think about is whether there's any adverse immigration history or criminal record, etc., that might impact the person's suitability for a visa. But if you can tick all those boxes, then generally you'll be able to sponsor. I'm just going to look in the next couple of slides then at the new salary requirements that have applied from the 4th of April. And the complexity, I think, in the new rules is evident there, because we have all sorts of different options and different salary requirements depending on the circumstances. In this first table here, and I'll come on in a few minutes to look at the second table, we've got the standard rates that apply if a person doesn't benefit from the transitional arrangements because they're a new visa applicant into the skilled worker route from the 4th of April, and they're not on a health and care visa. When we look at the next slide in a few minutes, you'll see that those are for people who benefit from the transitional arrangements, or they're on a health and care visa, or they're one of those special listed health and education jobs that I mentioned. So looking at this first table, first of all, there's various options that an employer can look at, and these go from A through to K on the course of this first and second slide, and those match the options in the immigration rules. In each case, the employer must check if the general salary threshold is met, and that's the first number in kind of red in each of these columns. The general one being 38,700, but very discounted ones available for all sorts of different circumstances. And in terms of how that's calculated, the individual employee must work enough hours to hit that minimum amount. It can't be kind of prorated just because the person's working part-time, for example. Discounts are available if the person's a new entrant, which we've talked about, if they've got a PhD or a PhD in a STEM subject, or in some cases, if the job is on the immigration salary list. The employer must also check the going rate for the occupation code, and there's discounts available for all of those circumstances, except on the immigration salary list, there is now no discount from the going rate. The going rate for these people applying who are new to the skilled worker route from the 4th of April onwards are now pegged to the median salary data published by ONS. So the going rates on the tables that you'll find on the UKVI website are median salary levels. They used to be pegged to the lower quartile, and that has meant a significant increase in those rates, which is causing some employers some challenges. That going rate, when you look at it on an annual basis, is based on a 37.5-hour week. If you've got a different working week, you need to prorate it up or down to make sure you meet the requirements. And then finally, there's an hourly rate that's in red in the columns there. If we just turn to the next table, and again, I'm not going to go through each of these in great detail, but these are far lower general thresholds available for people who do benefit from the transitional arrangements. So there's a significant benefit to people who were in the skilled worker route before the 4th of April, or who have a health and care visa, and they can also benefit from these much lower levels. The health and education occupation codes are dealt with in option K there, and if those apply, there's a general threshold, and then you just look at the national pay scales, which are published as going rates there. So you can see why it's complex. There's lots of different options, and the employer does need to work through all of those to make sure that they have arrived at the correct rates in terms of assessing whether a job is suitable for sponsorship. And these, transitional arrangements generally do benefit from about a £10,000 discount when it comes to the general salary amounts. So I'm going to hand over to Gregor at this point, who's going to take you through the next part.
Thank you very much, Elaine. So we're now going to come on to the sort of practical steps of how do you go about applying for and assigning certificates of sponsorship. So certificates of sponsorship, or COS, as they're sometimes referred to, These are digital documents, and it's essentially these documents which link a sponsor to a candidate. And it's kind of this point which crystallizes the sponsorship relationship between you and your employee. It's important to make sure that the job's skilled enough and meets all the criteria, as Elaine's been going through. Essentially because the Home Office expect you to confirm that the job will meet these requirements and that the information that you're providing them when you're applying for and assigning your certificates of sponsorship are all correct. So there are two types of certificates of sponsorship. It's important to know the difference between them and when you use them. So defined certificates of sponsorship are primarily used for those who are outside of the UK at the time you're looking to sponsor them. An undefined certificate of sponsorship, in contrast, is for use for those who are inside the UK when you're looking to sponsor them. So some common examples here is if you've got someone who's changing visa, for example, changing from a student visa or a graduate visa to become a skilled worker working for you, or perhaps they're changing employer, so from one skilled worker sponsor to another skilled worker sponsor, or maybe they're extending their existing skilled worker visa. It's worth flagging that there are other types of sponsor license or other tiers on your license that you might have, such as the Global Business Mobility routes, which talk about undefined certificates of sponsorship. Those different routes talk about undefined certificates of sponsorship, and they're used for either inside the UK or outside of the UK. But purely for today's purposes, we're just going to be looking at the skilled worker route, and we'll be looking at that distinction between the defined certificates and the undefined certificates. So the process to apply for and assign certificates of sponsorship are different depending on whether you are looking for a defined or an undefined certificate. So it's important to get it correct. It is considered a really serious breach if you do assign the wrong one to an individual. And sort of making that mistake can lead to some compliance breaches, and the sanctions for that go as far as revoking your license. UKVI will not always pick up that you get it wrong, and just because UKVI don't spot it and maybe they do go ahead and grant a visa on the back of that cost, that still doesn't cure the issue with the costs. The responsibility does ultimately lie with you as the sponsor. So if in doubt, pull out the guidance or reach out and take some advice if you're unsure about which one you need to use. So on the next slide, I thought it's worth giving a bit of an overview of the process as a whole. So the first step is to apply for the certificate of sponsorship. The second step is then to assign it to the individual that you want to sponsor. And then there's the third step where it's over to the individual to make their visa application. So the main parts for sponsors and employers are steps 1 and 2, and then it's pretty much over to the individual at step 3. Next slide, please. So if we now take a look at that step 1, so applying for the certificates of sponsorship, I thought it's worth first going through how you get an undefined certificate of sponsorship. So there are different ways to get the undefined certificates of sponsorship on your license. It certainly used to be the case that most sponsors would need to make a request for an annual allocation each year. Typically, the Home Office would contact you in advance of your sponsor license year coming to an end to ask how many certificates you think you need in the next year and why. So some sponsors will get some undefined certificates of sponsorship through a relatively new automatic allocation process. So this now operates if you're an A-rated sponsor with an active annual allocation, licensed on eligible routes, or which includes the skilled worker route, and if your license year expires on or after the 24th of June 2023. In those cases, you can benefit from the automatic allocation, which means that you'll likely receive an allocation in your next license year based on the number of certificates that you assigned during the previous year. So this annual allocation, it's essentially a bank of certificates of sponsorship that you can use during that year. It is a privilege and not a right to have these sitting available on your license each year. UKVI will look at the sort of credibility and any past non-compliance that you've got. It's never a guarantee that you'll get an annual allocation, even when you do request them. But as long as you're keeping everything up to date with your compliance, most sponsors do not have an issue with getting their undefined cost allocations. It's always helpful to justify the number that you're requesting when you're requesting them. Sometimes you'll know you need some. So for example, if you know someone's visa is going to be expiring in the next year, and they're going to need to extend their visa. Or for example, if you know you need to sponsor someone who's coming to the end of a different type of visa. So for example, someone on a student visa that you need to sponsor as a skilled worker. It's that type of information that's helpful to provide in your justification. And the more detail you can generally provide, the better. If you don't know how many you'll need, and if you're not being given an annual allocation, you could in theory make a speculative application, as it's known. So this is made on the basis that you think there's a chance you might need them. UKVI are not obliged to give you them, and they could give you less than you ask for. So for example, if you ask for 4 just because you think it might be handy to have them there, UKVI may only grant you 2, or they may not grant you any if, for example, you've had lots in the past, but you haven't used them before. But if you can provide the justification, you can give yourself a good chance of getting some. Many employers do ask us what happens if we run out of our annual allocation, or if we don't get granted any, or if someone turns up out of the blue. There's no need to panic. There is a way to get certificates of sponsorship sort of outside of that annual allocation cycle. You can also apply for extra certificates of sponsorship during the sponsor license year if you do use up your annual allocation. And we'll come on to that and go through a few screenshots in a second of how that's done in practice. So if we move on to the first screenshot, this screenshot is taken from the SMS, so that's your online sponsorship management system. So the first step is to log on, and then you can click into License Summary Applications and Services at the top on the left-hand side. And then you can click into Request Cost Allocation Increase. So this page is quite helpful in showing you how many undefined costs you have, depending on what sponsor license tiers you have available on your license. If you did need to request more during your sponsor license year, you can click the button which says Add a Request under the appropriate category there. When you are making a request to supplement the number of certificates of sponsorship during the year, so if you've used up your annual allocation, you should only be doing that on an as-needed basis. You can't make a sort of in-year request for extra certificates of sponsorship on a speculative basis. UKVI will be expecting a justification for why you need those certificates, and this ideally should include the details mentioned on the slide, so including job titles, salary, job codes, why you need an undefined certificate of sponsorship, and why the individual needs to be sponsored. So for example, if they're switching from a different type of visa and they're currently based in the UK, you should also give some details for the candidate themselves. It's essentially UKVI will want to know that this is the appropriate route for sponsorship and that the individual is going to meet the eligibility criteria. So on the next slide, we're going to move on to defined certificates of sponsorship. So these certificates are different. As a reminder, it's for those who are based outside the UK when you're applying. So these ones are always applied for on an as-needed basis. The form does request some specific information about job codes, salaries, start dates, etc. So it's worth having those details available when you are going on to apply for your defined certificates of sponsorship. These ones can be accessed by clicking into workers this time, and then into defined costs as is highlighted on the screen. It's important to make sure that you take all the steps that you need to do for defined costs, and you fill in all the details that you need there. You can see the link here in the Apply for Defined Costs, which takes you onto the form. The good news is these certificates of sponsorship applications are typically processed in around 1 working day, which is a lot faster in contrast to the undefined certificate application process. Since defined costs are only ever applied for on an as-needed basis, they're usually granted much faster, although it is possible for there to be delays, particularly if the Home Office require any additional information from you. In contrast, undefined cost requests can take up to 18 weeks to process, and it's worth mentioning these timescales are not guaranteed. So for many employers, if you have got a candidate, and you may well not have 18 weeks to spare to wait for an undefined cost to be granted, there is a priority service available for most sponsors who can use it, and this costs £200 and aims to return a decision within 5 working days. Further details of this are on the gov.uk website, but it's important to just bear in mind those 2 different timescales there. So on the next slide, this gives you an idea of what the form looks like. When you click in, this is the type of information it's looking for. So you can see it's a lot more specific information, and unlike the undefined cost application where you're essentially presented with two free text boxes, one where you put in the number of costs you need, and then a free text box to put in your explanation, here it will give you individual fields asking for specific details like salary, job codes, job description, which is subject to a 1,000 character limit, as well as start dates and end dates. It will also ask if the job is on a client contract. So there are specific rules in place here, and it's best to check the guidance each time if you're dealing with this type of situation to see whether you could send a worker out to work on a client contract. As this is not always permitted, you might want to reach out to us if you had any questions about that. So on the next step, we'll move on to the second stage in the process. So let's assume that you've been granted the cost that you have requested, and you now need to assign it to the worker. Thank you so much. So this slide here gives you a screenshot of that kind of next step, specifically for the undefined certificates of sponsorship. So the assigning stage, it's this step where you're essentially linking the individual to your sponsor license. So if you've applied for your undefined certificate of sponsorship, you'll usually get an email telling you if your request's been successful, if it's been granted, or it might already be sitting on your license ready for you to use, in which case you can skip ahead to this step. So you'd go into the workers section, and then at this time into create and assign, which takes you to this page shown here once you select a couple of options to do with what route you're using, and then the correct option when it comes onto the immigration skills charge and whether it applies. We'll come on to that just in a second. But on this page, you'll see there's a lot more specific details at this stage. So it's asking here for the salary, the job title, job descriptions, and job codes. But it also asks for some personal details about the migrant worker. So that includes nationality, passport details, address details, and their other personal details. It's very specific what it needs here. It is possible to click onto this page and then to exit this page once you've kind of clicked in, see what information you need. You could then speak to the individual to get anything that you're missing. You would then go ahead and click the assign button. And once the fees are paid, it's that stage that crystallizes the sponsorship, i.e. the link between the individual worker and your business as a sponsor. So on the next step, this is a screenshot for the defined certificates of sponsorship. You should always make sure that you go to the correct place when you're looking to assign certificates of sponsorship. So for defined costs, you go into workers, but you always go through the defined costs option. And this time you're clicking into granted applications, create and assign defined costs, as is highlighted on the screen. The form is very similar to the one on previous screen, but a lot more of the information will have pulled through just because at the time you applied for that defined certificate of sponsorship, you had to enter some of that information already. So it will carry it forward, and it's usually just the individual's personal details that you have to add on. It's worth flagging that under both types of certificates of sponsorship, there is a question there which asks you whether a candidate needs an ATAS certificate. This is essentially an enhanced security background check for certain roles. For the vast majority of sponsors, the answer will almost always be no, unless you are also a student sponsor, in which case this one might be relevant to you. Do always check if this is relevant to you, but otherwise the answer is likely to be no. Once you have filled in the form and you click the assign button, as I mentioned, you'll then sign a declaration and then pay the required fees. We'll come on to the fees in more detail in a second, but the fees are essentially the cost assigning fee, which is a flat rate under the skilled worker route of £239. You'll then also pay the immigration skills charge if the cost is liable for you to pay immigration skills charge. And the charge does vary depending on a number of factors, including the size or chargeable status of your organization and the length of the visa that you're sponsoring. You will need a card to be able to pay these fees. It's not something you can pay through alternative means, so it can't be invoiced and then repaid. It does have to be paid by card. So moving on to the next step. So we've now done steps 1 and 2. That's largely the role of the employer done at this stage. It's now over to the individual to make their visa application. So this is completed online, and they will often have to submit some supporting documents. We'll come on to those in just a second. So before they can go ahead, and do their visa application, the sponsor will need to provide the certificate of sponsorship number to the employee. So just at the end of step 2, it will generate the certificate of sponsorship, which has a number on it, which you'll then have to send to the applicant. You'll also have to send them a note of your sponsor license number as well. It's that number, when entered on the visa application form, that links their application to your sponsor license. So the form is completed on the Home Office website. It includes a lot of factual details about them, including personal information, names, nationalities, dates of birth, some details of parents, and also some residential addresses, as well as a few declarations. It's usually quite a straightforward step, although there can be a couple of questions which can catch some people out if they're unsure, so it might be worth taking advice if that comes across. They'll also need to think about what supporting documents that they need. Everyone will usually need their passport. In some cases, if they're applying for the visa from a country that they're not a nationality of, but if they're maybe resident in that country, they can need evidence of their residency status in that other country. As Elaine's mentioned already, depending on their nationality, they may also need evidence of their English language ability, which for skilled worker purposes is level B1. There are a number of ways of showing this. It can be by the passport if they're from one of the countries recognized as being English speaking, or it could be an English language test. So there is a list of approved test providers, approved types of test, and approved venues published online. There's various requirements about the test, including the level of security that it's done in. It has to be a secure English language test. And the test must also cover all 4 elements. It's best to check the guidance before booking any test, just to make sure that the test is eligible and to confirm that you're doing the UKVI version that is approved for the purposes of visa applications. Some individuals, if they have studied certain qualifications in English, as Elaine's mentioned, so typically degree level at some institutions, usually universities, they can use that as evidence, subject to some individuals having to verify their qualification through ECTIS. Individuals also need to meet the financial maintenance requirement. In many cases, an employer can certify their maintenance on the certificate of sponsorship through the SMS at the time they're assigning it. This is essentially saying that they'll guarantee the maintenance requirement. It's confirmation that if the individual needed funds in the first month, those could be provided rather than the individual relying on public funds. It can be capped at the amount shown on the slide, which is £1,270, although it's slightly more if there are family members applying too. In the vast majority of cases, the guarantee is never called up, and certifying maintenance on the SMS is generally the easiest way to meet this requirement, and it's the option we often recommend to clients. If the sponsor did not do that for whatever reason, the most common way of demonstrating the financial maintenance requirement is to provide bank statements that meet the requirements, showing that an individual's held the £1,270. That's for a single applicant. If there are children or dependent partners applying too, the number is higher. That sum has to have been held in the bank account for 28 days in a row, with day 28 being within 31 days of applying for the visa. There are specific requirements about bank statements and the evidence that can be provided, so always check the guidance. Some applicants, depending on where they've been living, may also need to provide a TB test. There is a published list online of who needs to submit this, and the requirements that the certificate must show are set out online. Some individuals may also need to submit evidence of their criminal record checks. That's only for certain roles. And then if you have dependents applying too, typically marriage certificates or birth certificates will be required. If they are bringing dependents, each of them need to create their own visa application form, and there are separate fees that apply to each person applying. So on the next slide, it's worth flagging that if you are assisting an employee through the visa application process, generally immigration advice is regulated and can only be provided by lawyers or OISC regulated advisors. There is an exception for sponsors. So if you're in an organization and you have a sponsor license and you're sponsoring someone, you can provide assistance to an employee or job applicant applying through the skilled worker route for a visa, as long as that advice is provided free of charge and it's provided by the sponsor itself. It's unlikely to extend to advice that's being provided through a third party, so a HR consultant service, for example. It's important just to be mindful of this regulatory detail. Some employers will go ahead with all of these steps themselves, particularly if They are doing it often and they get familiar with the process, but many will still take advice as the rules do change regularly. And as we've mentioned today, there have been very significant changes recently, and it's a case of the devil is in the detail with the skilled worker sponsorship process. I'll now hand back to Elaine.
Thanks, Gregor. Just to finish off then, I think this slide's hopefully helpful in comparing and contrasting the process and the timing for a candidate who's inside the UK, where you're looking at an undefined cause process, as compared to somebody who's outside of the UK. I won't go through all of these timings in detail because Gregor's covered a fair amount of it, but you can see, for example, that first stage, if you don't have a cause, can take up to 18 weeks, but if you expedite it, you should be able to get one within 5 days using that priority service. Assigning the causes in a kind of instantaneous process where you pay the fee online. The details of some of the fees are up there for you, including the application fees from inside the UK, which differ from outside of the UK. And overall, hopefully that timeline gives you a rough idea. For candidates outside the UK, the process of applying for a defined cause should just be a day or two, but actually at the moment there's significant delays. In some cases it's taking up to a month, for example, if there's queries back and forward from UKVI and they've got some delays involved in that. Assigning the causes then that sort of instant process. The visa application in normal cases will take up to 3 weeks to process from the point of submission, but there are usually priority services available for people applying from outside of the UK. So if you're in a rush, do take advice, and that those services depend on the local application centre that the person's applying from. So if we just turn to the final slide, I think just to finish off by mentioning there are obligations on licensed sponsors. On the compliance side, it's really important that you keep on top of those. The record keeping ones, the best place to look is Appendix D, which tells you all the documentation you need to have on file, including some dealing with the recruitment process. Despite the fact there is no resident labour market test, you still do need to keep evidence of the recruitment process that you went through. So do look at that as you go through the process of sponsorship. And if you're interested in knowing more about sponsor duties and reporting, all of that guidance is available online. And we also have a separate session on compliance, which is worth looking at. So if we just move to the final, I think, slide. Yes, if you've got any questions, please do get in touch. I think Gregor's details and my details are on the final slide there. And thank you very much for joining.